Hi, I'm Alex James, and today's guest with me is Noel Stephen Smith. Now, Noel Stephen Smith was known as Noel Razor, or was it Razor Smith? No,
It's Razor Smith, yeah.
Razor Smith. And you have a really interesting and inspirational story to tell. So, Noel, tell me a little bit about when you were a boy, where you grew up, so we can get round to your story and then sort of come forward in time. So,
well, I was born in London in 1960, Christmas Eve. My parents were both Irish immigrants who had moved over to London in 1959, 1958. And my early childhood was spent in North London, which in the 1960s was quite a different area to what it is today. It was only 15 years after the war. There was a lot of houses had been bombed. There was a lot of bomb sites. And we lived in absolute poverty. I mean, when I tell my kids about it, they laugh, but we actually were 4 families living in one house. We lived in the basement, and we had a tin bath that was kept out in the garden, and it was dragged in every week, and the water was heated up on a coal fire, and we all had a bath in that. We never had no money. My dad was a labourer, and my mum worked as a cleaner. She held down 3 jobs at one time, and we grew up in absolute poverty. In 1969, they were pulling down the place where we lived in North London, Hollingsworth Street, and they had what had happened was a lot of the families who lived there were immigrants, Irish, Scottish, Jamaican, from all around the world.
yeah.
And it was so bad, this place. I mean, it was absolute filth. Next door to us, there was a house had been bombed, and it became a dumping ground for rubbish, as a lot of them were around there. People would just throw things over the fence. And one of our neighbours put her newborn baby out in the sun in the front street to get a bit of air. And when she came out, there was a huge rat in the pram trying to bite the baby. So that became a big thing in the newspapers around there, the local paper. And the women, including my mother, were invited onto there used to be a programme called Today with Eamon Andrews, which was on after the news on ITV. And they were invited onto that, and they told their story of the filth we were living in. And the council quickly rehoused everybody, and we ended up in South London because my granddad lived in South London. Everyone else went elsewhere in North London. And we moved over to South London, Balham, into a council flat, a 3-bedroom council flat. It was the first time we'd ever had any heating in the flat and hot water.
And a toilet, probably. Did you have
an
outside?
bath. Yeah. Well, there was an outside toilet.
An outside toilet, yeah, I remember those.
And when I was about 7, I went out to go to the toilet one night, and it was a really stormy, snowy night. And my leg got caught in a bit of wire that was wrapped around a big old cast iron mangle, which came down and shattered my left leg when I was 7, and I was left out. Nobody knew I was out in the garden, and the snow was falling. By the time they found me 2 hours later, I was suffering from hypothermia, had a shattered leg. That when I was 7 years old. So I was quite glad to move out of that place. It had some very bad memories.
Do you remember that? Those outside toilets, they used to have newspaper.
Yeah.
Used to have newspaper, not toilet. And they always had the same smell, didn't they? I don't know. And I think, my one, where I grew up, all the neighbours shared the same toilet. There was like a couple together, I think, and just outside toilets. Must have been a similar sort of house. Yeah. But poor.
So in South London, it was a lot better until I started going to secondary school. Obviously, when we lived in North London, that was the last place we lived, but we'd moved around a lot because we always lived in rooms. We never had a council flat or anything. So every time we moved, I had to go into a new school. So I didn't get much education, and I became disinterested in school, really. And then in South London, I was settling in quite well. And then I reached the age of 11, and I had to go to a secondary modern school, which was a place called Tulse Hill Secondary Modern. It's been pulled down since. There's now a housing estate there. It was 8 floors. It was like a big office block. It was 8 floors of glass and steel of classrooms. And it was the catchment area for Brixton, Tulse Hill, Balham, Stockwell, Vauxhall. It was a very, very rough school. It was 1,200 boys. It was a boys only school, and that's where I learned to fight. And learned to hate school, really. And that eventually, being at that school, led to me becoming a criminal in a strange kind of way. What actually happened was, when I was 14 years old, absolutely hated school, used to go and get my mark in the morning, then me and my mate would go off. And what we'd do is, we'd either catch a bus up to Kensington and spend a day in the museums if it was cold out, or we'd go in a library if it was really cold. In the summer, we usually went down to a girls' school called Lara Trait and would hang around outside the girls' school when we were 14, trying to catch the eye of some girls, which never really worked. But anyway, one day, me and my mate Mickey were playing truant. We were in a place called Gypsy Hill in South London. And we were just messing about as kids do. We weren't thieves, we weren't villains. We were basically just kids. We'd stolen some apples off an apple tree in the past. I'd stolen a Mars bar out of my local shop, and that was about as far as our criminality went. Unfortunately, we happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time that day. We were both in school uniforms, so it was quite obvious we were schoolboys. And as we were walking through Gypsy Hill, an old Commer van pulled up next to us. And some huge big men jumped out, plain clothes, smelling strongly of drink, grabbed us round the neck and dragged us into the van, where they proceeded to torture us and beat us for about the next 20 minutes. One of them grabbed hold of my finger and snapped it in half, and I became unconscious. And they brought us round and then threatened to do my other finger on the other hand. It turned out they were an undercover burglary squad of police officers who had a bit of a bad reputation back in the 1970s there for corruption and brutality. And they'd been out drinking that day and decided we looked like a couple of likely lads, and they tried to get us to admit to 60 burglaries. And they were calling us burglars and beating us in the van. And then when we got to the police station, the thing that really shocked me at the age of 14, I mean, the beating and the torture was enough, but they actually dragged us through the front of the police station where women were there typing and didn't even look up while these police officers were beating us and dragging us through. We were screaming, the two of us, obviously. We were in severe pain. Later on, they took us out of the cell and they opened up the books, and basically they told us that me and my friend were to admit to every single burglary they had on their books that hadn't been cleared up. So we admitted to, I can't remember the exact number, it was somewhere around 63 burglaries. We just said, yes, we've done them. We were terrified. We wanted to get out. We would have admitted to anything. So eventually my mum came up to pick me up from the police station because I was only 14. And she went mad when she saw the state of me and my finger, dragged me back into the police station, demanded to know what was going on, as any mother would. And the police officers, I was 14, I couldn't do anything. These police officers took her aside and said, look, madam, they were really polite and everything and reasonable, and said the boys were actually committing a burglary when we arrested him, and he fell off the wall and broke his finger. This is what they told my mother. And that's why I had these bruises on my face, and, and my friend as well. They told his mum that he, the same. They'd caught us doing a burglary and we'd fallen off the wall. Of course, we didn't know anything about this back in those days. We didn't know how common it was. It was just a shock to us. We were just children. And basically what happened in the death of it, we ended up at Balham Juvenile Court a week later. And we were quite lucky in the 1970s to have a magistrate who did not just take the police word for it. She was quite disturbed that we, as 14-year-old schoolboys, were admitting burglaries, some of which had been committed at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And antiques had been stolen. We didn't know what an antique was. I mean, we didn't have a clue. We were basically South London kids with very little education, and we were a prime target for them. But this magistrate, we told a story to our solicitor, and he told the magistrate, and the magistrate ordered an investigation immediately. She said, I'm not having this. She said, we've got 2 young kids here. You're saying they've done 63 burglaries all over the place. When you ask them when they got rid of the gear, they say they sold it in a pub. They're 14. So she ordered an investigation, and it turned out they kind of picked up on what had happened to us, and we were advised, the charges were dropped, and we were advised to sue the police for what they'd done to us. But of course, when you're 14, suing the police takes 4 or 5 years in those days. You had to go through court cases. You had to have money. And in the first 3 months of this happening, the police they waged a vendetta against me and my pal to try and get us to drop our stories and get us to drop the charges. And every time I left my estate, the police would drag me into the back of a van, give me a few slaps, twist my hair, pull my ear, poke me in the eye, and tell me, drop the charges and say no more about it, or your life's going to be hell. My mate got it as well. And then one day, my brother, who was 2 years younger than me, was wearing my jacket, come out of the estate and was dragged into a police car and roughed up because they thought it was me. So eventually, in my 14-year-old immature mind, I was a bit of an adventurous kid. And I thought to myself, I came to a decision one day and I thought, you know what, the best way to stop because they were raiding my mum's house at 6 a.m, saying they were looking for stolen goods and stuff like that, just wrecking the place. And I thought to myself, do you know what? If I leave home, it'll be easier for my family. So I ran away from home at the age of 14 and I was living in a derelict car, a Triumph Herald, if you want to know what it was, on one of the estates. And that's how I got into criminality, because I had to be a criminal to survive on the streets.
Wow. Did your mum keep in touch with you?
Yeah,
they
yeah.
Keep in touch with the family and everything?
Oh, yeah. My mum, I remember my mum used to meet me and she used to bring sandwiches at the phone box outside the estate, because we had to be very careful. If the police saw me, that was it. And she used to bring me sandwiches and warm jumpers and stuff like that and be crying. And, you know, it was a bit of a bad time, really. And, you know, from that, I got into crime, because what happened was, being immature and seeing what had happened to me. And before this, I'd quite like the police. You know, if somebody said to me, what do you want to be when you grow up? A policeman would be like about third on my list, because I'd watch programs like Z Cars and Dixon and Doc Green. That were going to be, you know, the police were always the heroes and the nice people. They were the goodies. Now I'd suddenly found out at the age of 14, they weren't the goodies. They were the baddies. And I decided, because they kept raiding my mum's house, that I was going to give them a criminal. If they wanted a criminal, I was going to be a criminal. So my first, it
was also survival, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Really, no.
My first foray into criminality was there was a guy on an estate near us who was a biker, and he taught me how to hotwire motorbikes. I asked him, and he showed me how to do it. So my sort of young life then became, you know, I'd steal motorbikes and I'd ride them around the streets with no crash on me, looking for police cars. This is what I'd done. I would look for a police car, pull alongside the police car, kick the door, give them plenty of that, and get them to chase me. And I'd always get away, because I knew all the back streets of South London where I lived. You know, I'd grown up like around there. So they found it very hard to catch me. And then one night I went into the back of Clapham police station, Union Grove, in the middle of the night and stole a policeman's personal motorbike. And that, of course, that set them off even worse. I was riding it around the streets for about 2 weeks with no crash on me, and they could never catch me. And they beat up a lot of my mates, give them slaps, and one of them got hit in the head with a radio, looking for me, telling him this is what he's going to get if he don't bring that bike back. But of course, being a bit spiteful now and seeing what they were doing to my pals, I dumped his bike into Clapham Common Pond and phoned up the police station and said it's in the pond. So, of course, this, you know, all this was going on over a period of about 3 or 4 months. And it was inevitable I was going to get arrested for some of this. And I did. One time, I've got to say, I drove a stolen motorbike at 4 o'clock in the morning up to Streatham Police Station and launched a brick through the window of Streatham Police Station at 4 o'clock in the morning, because they'd raided my mum's house again. And, you know, I was just really immature and uneducated, and I didn't really have a clue what I was doing, and I was living from day to day. It was, you know, it was like that. And eventually I got arrested, and they came down heavy on me. And what happened was I was given 3 months detention at Send Detention Centre in Woking, Surrey. I was 14 at the time.
Is that like a Borstal?
No, in those days it was called the short, sharp shock. Oh. Now, it might be hard for people to believe this now. This was actual government policy. At the time, they decided that the way to put juveniles off crime was being absolutely brutal to them while they were in incarceration. So that would give them the message, don't come back. But of course, that didn't work. The more brutal they got with us, and they were brutal, believe me, grown men beating you when you're 14 is no fun, you know. One of the first things they've done in Send VC, I'll give you a little bit of a flavour of it. I was in Balham Juvenile Court, and I'm in the cell. I've just been sentenced to my 3 months, and I'm there having a fag. I've got a cigarette in my mouth and my leather jacket with my collar turned up, thinking I'm Jack the Lad, but terrified because I'm going into prison for the first time, but trying to put on a front. And 2 guys come in, 2 grown men, and in detention centres, in juvenile detention centres, they didn't wear prison uniform, the officers. That was their one sort of concession to us being kids. But what they'd done was they found a way around that. They would wear the prison issue black raincoat, but with the epaulets turned over so you could vaguely see HMP. But they all wore these long black raincoats and leather gloves. And they came into the cell, and the first thing they said was stand up. I stood up, and they punched me. One of them punched me straight in the jaw, knocked me on the floor. Get up. So I've stood up. What's your name? Smith. No. Crack. Another punch. Don't want to know what your mummy calls you. What's your name? So I stood up. I went. I realised they want my surname. I went Smith. Another punch from the other one. I've gone down again. He said, "You say sir every time you talk to an officer." They took me and a couple of other guys into the van, and all the way down to Surrey, they took great delight in telling us what they were going to do to us and what we were in for. One of the guys I was with was absolutely terrified. I was terrified, but I wouldn't show it. I tried to keep a stoic face on it, but I was terrified. And when the van pulled in at Send, there was 6 prison officers, 3 down either side with their shirt sleeves rolled up. And as we come off the van, we got punched, kicked, hair pulled, run into reception. In the reception, we were made to strip naked and stand there while they made disparaging remarks for about an hour and a half. And one guy, the fellow was so terrified, what happened was the screws used to start everything with, "When I say go." That was their favourite saying, "When I say go," and then they tell you what they want you to do. They took us into the bathroom, and the screw said to me and this other guy, "When I say go, you run in there, jump into them baths and scrub your stinking bodies and get out. Don't take no more than 2 minutes. What have you got to do?" And the other guy went, "Jump into the bath." He went, "Yeah, that's right." And he went, "Go." And there was 6 inches of water in the bath. I got into my bath. He was so terrified, he jumped, come down and broke both his elbows in the bath when he landed. So he was out straight away. He was shipped out to a hospital. And then it was just horrific. It was like a boot camp, really, but with more violence. They would actually physically assault you all the time. But what happened there was, because it was so terrible, we kind of banded together, all the inmates. We're all around the same age, and we had a common enemy now. You know, we were fighting against this system right from day one. We knew that was them and this was us. So what you would do is you would try and dodge the punches. You'd roll with a punch. You'd know when they lifted their hand, they were going to hit you. So you'd learn things as you was there. And as the weeks went by, you kind of picked up on it, and you sort of went to the back of the queue as the new people got the beatings. You know, you were an old hand after a couple of weeks. But what it done for me was we banded together in adversary, and I met a guy from North London, from my old area. And you've got to say, as kids, all our excitement was about armed robbery. And the reason being, because of all the television programs that were on at the time, Robin Hood, you know, he was an armed robber. Dick Turpin was a hero in England, when in reality he wasn't. You know, as being a highwayman and stuff like that. We loved Robin Hood and all that stuff. We loved all that. And Dillinger and things like that. Pretty Boy Floyd, the American gangsters. So our kind of our aim, really, our ambition was to be big in crime. There was no way. We're in there now, and we're not saying, "Oh, this has taught me a lesson." You know, I mean, I'm not going to commit another crime. What we were actually doing was planning our next crimes to get our own back on society for what was happening to us. Do you know what I mean? It had the complete opposite effect that people wanted it to have. It made us more criminal. It made us more wanting to get revenge on these people because we were bullied unmercilessly, and this was the system. We're looking at these people who are supposed to be the goodies, and they're the baddies. The whole world is turned upside down to us kids. So, incidentally, they stopped the Short Sharp Shock in 1982 because so many kids had died under it. You know, people did die. Kids died from the beatings and from the exercise they made us do, like 5 in the morning with just a pair of pajamas, bottoms on, no shoes or socks, bare chested, with your bed pack on your back, bunny hopping around the floor in November, a path. They used to do that to us every hour. So I met this guy, and his brother was a bit older and had a gun for sale. So I thought, I'm getting into armed robbery. That's what I'm going to do. And when I got out, sure enough, we met up a couple of weeks later, and I ended up paying £20 for a single barrel Stevens shotgun with no ammunition. And he also threw in a Luger pistol with a bent barrel that didn't have no magazine. So the guns weren't capable of being fired, but they looked the part. And I put together a little team, a couple of guys from another estate. We're all still 15. And we planned our first robbery on a record shop, funny enough. And we ended up doing the robbery and getting £10, which was absolute rubbish money. And one of the other guys I was with said, I'm not doing no more, that's enough for me. And he left. So we had £3.33 each. And you think that had put us off, but the excitement had hooked me. You know, the excitement of actually doing it, the adrenaline. And I know now what it was. Up until then, I'd been an insignificant kid. I'd been bullied and beaten by adults for a long time. Then all of a sudden, when I've got a gun in my hand, people are doing what I say. Suddenly I feel powerful. You know, for the first time in my life, I feel as though I'm in control and nobody else is. And I just got the bug for it. And I thought, I want to do more of this. And we did several robberies, never great money or anything. You know, it was always, I think the most we got was £300, and that was a one-off. And eventually in the end of 1976, I was arrested along with a mate of mine for 3 armed robberies, grievous bodily harm with intent. In one of the robberies, my mate had, one of the shopkeepers had fought back, and my mate had hit him on the head with a bottle of lemonade. So that was the GBH. And possession of firearms. And went up to the Old Bailey at the age of 15, when most of my contemporaries were in juvenile court. And we went in front of a judge, pleaded guilty on the provision a deal was done that I would get 6 months in a detention centre, and my mate who'd been in Borstal would get a recall to Borstal. But of course, British justice doesn't really do deals like American justice does. And it turns out they just said that to get us to plead guilty. And when we pleaded guilty, my mate was given 3 years in YP, and I was sentenced to 3 years as a young offender under the Children and Young Persons Act 1933. Now, the reason why these sentences were very rarely given out to juveniles, and the wording on them now, you can still look up this sentence, section 53, paragraph 2, is that a juvenile would have to have committed crimes that would warrant 14 years imprisonment or more in an adult in order to get one of these sentences. So they decided, because of my robberies and firearms, if I was an adult, I'd be getting 16 years. So I got this 3 years. And what they didn't tell us at the start of it, or me, is that you had to do every day of it. Never knew that. All the other kids were getting Borstals. They'd done 9 months and got out. And the only place they could put me in was Borstal. So in the Borstal system that I was in, there was 5 people doing the sentence I was doing. 3 of them were doing HMP for murders they committed as kids. Me doing 3 years for robbery, and my mate doing 3 years for a burglary in Essex. So we were looked up to by the Borstal boys, because we were doing Big Bird. We were, you know, proper prisoners. But the only place they could put us was in the Borstal system. And that created problems, because I didn't want to be in the Borstal system. I didn't want to be marching and making up bed packs and calling people sir. I had 3 years to do, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do every day of this, and I don't care, I'm going to do it my way. And that led to me becoming a rebel in jail. I had loads of fights with other inmates, assaulted prison officers, you know, was involved in sit-downs and riots in the Borstal system, in Dover in particular. And eventually what they'd done was I became so bad, and there was nothing they could do with me. I wasn't a Borstal boy. With Borstal boys, they could call you in and go, if you don't behave yourself, you won't be going home next week, or you won't be going home on your date. I didn't have a date. I was in 1977. My date was 1980. And people used to say to me, kids at the time, 1980, they'd be flying around on jetpacks by the time you get out. You know, and that's how far away it was. So I became a bit of a, I suppose you'd say, a right bastard in prison. I decided to cause them as much problems as I could. It was, to me, it was great. It was like striking back after all this stuff that they'd done to me. I was finally free of any thoughts of, what's going to happen to me. I did not care. So I got involved in everything. And Christmas 1977, bearing in mind my birthday's Christmas Eve, I decided to escape. They put me in an escape-proof wing in Rochester, C wing. It had just been built specifically to stop people escaping. And I spotted a flaw in their security. So I escaped from my cell in the middle of the night, got out on the landing, and it's a long story, but I ended up attacking the night watchman when he saw me to try and get his keys. And I beat him across the head with a steel bucket, blood everywhere. He collapsed onto the floor. And then when I searched him, he had no keys and there was no keys there. And it turns out the keys are not even held by the night watchman. They're held by somebody else. So I'm stuck on this wing with a night watchman pouring blood out of his head. And I'm the only one out of my cell at Christmas Eve, my birthday. Anyway, eventually he recovered, the night watchman, while I was in the office downstairs, pressed the alarm bell. And then I had 6 prison officers beating the life out of me and dragging me to solitary confinement on Christmas Eve. They threw me into an underground cell, a cell within a cell, and I was in there for 9 months. I ended up serving 9 months. I was 16. It was my birthday.
How do you keep your mind when you're in that?
You don't. No. I went quite mad after about 4 months and tried to kill myself. I really did.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain it. There's a rule of silence in this place. You're allowed out for exercise every 3 weeks for 20 minutes, but it's not in the open air. You walk around inside the wing. There's nobody, you don't see nobody. The only people you see are the screws who come every morning to deliver your food, take your food away, take your mattress out. Your mattress comes out of the cell at 7 o'clock in the morning. You're in a bare room with absolutely nothing except a plastic piss pot, because you're not allowed to use any toilets. You have to use a piss pot. And there's 2 bits of wood, one coming off for a table and one coming off for a chair off the wall. So they're built into the wall. So there's nothing in there. And I couldn't read or write. So you imagine at the age of 16, I'd be in there absolutely going mad. There's no talking. There's a rule of silence. The only people you see every day are people who hate you. You've beaten one of their own. So they're not, I had them for the first couple of weeks spitting into my food as they gave it to me. There's no escape. You're in it. Who can you tell? You're 16 years old. You've got 2.5 years left to serve in prison, which when you're 16 is like a lifetime.
So how I know we're going to go through your prison life, but I can't get my head around how you could survive something like that. How you can survive that.
What I used to do was, I couldn't read, but you were allowed out your cell once a day for 5 minutes to pick up a book. They had a filing cabinet down the end, and all these books back in the 70s, they were hardbacks that had been donated to the Borstal by the Royal Navy. So they were quite old books, like 1930s Agatha Christie's and stuff like that, and they all smelled of mildew. So I used to go out. I couldn't read, but I'd go out just for the sake of getting out the cell for 5 minutes, get my book, and when I come back into the cell, I would kick the book around the cell as a footballer, take my socks off, roll them into a ball and kick my socks around the cell playing football. And then I discovered that if I went into the corner of the cell and put my face in between the walls, I could actually talk to myself and I could sing if I wasn't too loud. And what I used to do is act out all the parts of films I'd seen whilst I was in it. So every now and again, if I got too loud, the screw would come down, bang on the door with the and shut up. You know what I mean? And that was it. And then after about 3 months, you could vaguely hear the screws' voices up in the office, but it was really echoey. And I was going a bit mad from the solitary, and I started thinking that they were talking about my mum. So I became convinced that they were planning to kill her, even though she wasn't in the Borstal and she wasn't anywhere near. I became convinced that they were planning in the office to kill my mother. So I had a pair of prison jeans on and I broke the metal zipper off the jeans, sharpened it up on the ground, and then tried to take the vein out my wrist. Oh. And I got quite deep in. I've got a very bad scar there. I got quite deep in, and eventually they looked through the hatch and saw me in a pool of blood and took me up to the hospital. And then I was put into mental observation cells, a padded cell, where they kept me for days on end and force fed me this medication, Largactil. zombie juice, if they used to call it in Borstal. And after you've taken Largactil, you actually turn into a zombie. It's called the Largactil shuffle. You dribble, you think you're moving normally, but you're not. An example of this, me and a mate of mine, Vince Kennedy, he's dead now, but Vince, I knew him on the out. And me and Vince were in there at the same time, and we were both on Largactil. And they let us out one afternoon for association for half an hour. And we were quite delighted. And there was a table tennis table there. So Vince said to me, do you fancy a game of table tennis? I said, yeah. We're both Largactil up. We don't know what we look like. So Vince has gone, I'll serve. So he threw the ball up. And by the time he brought it back up to there, the ball's already over there. He doesn't realise, he still thinks the ball's coming down, and so do I. And eventually he goes, oh, the ball, I'll get it. He's gone for about 10 minutes to get the ball 5 foot away. But we don't notice this, that we're in slow motion. You know, you don't realise it until you see other people like it. But then what they done was they eventually let me out the padded cell and told me that I was getting an injection of something. I think now it was Thorazine. I was getting an injection of something. They were going to give it to me, whether I liked it or not. They held me down and injected me. And then they said to me, we'll let you up on a wing, a different wing. But you have to take these pills every day, 3 times a day. And if you don't take them, there'll be trouble. So I thought, right. Went up on the wing, see me mates. After 2 days, thought, I'm not taking them pills. So I used to dodge them every time. The pills, I'd throw them away. And after about 4 days, it started affecting me, the injection. And what happened was, it was like cramps all over my body. My fingers were like that. I was bending up like that, and I couldn't move myself up to look. And 2 screws had to come and put a broom handle through my arms and carry me over to the medics, the hospital, which was right next door to my wing. And they give me another injection. And the doctor said to me, you could die if you don't take them pills. They counteract the injection, so you've got to take them. So I did then. But I ended up doing every single day of my sentence. I was released in 1980 as a bitter and twisted 19-year-old who had been drugged up. I'd been in a straitjacket for 4 hours. I'd been in padded cells. I'd been beaten. You know, basically, it wasn't a very good life. But I came out and thought to myself at the age of 19, what am I good for? All I'm good for is crime. That's all I've done. I've passed no exams. I haven't had a job since I left school. I've done nothing. So I got out and I went at crime and tried to make a job of that. Unfortunately, I wasn't very good at it because I ended up serving 32 years in prison. But, I didn't see any other choice.
In that 32 years, you turned it around, didn't you? Because you learnt to read. Did you teach yourself to read? No.
I actually learnt to read during that 9 months in Rochester Borstal. And it was down to I'm not a religious person, but it was down to a Catholic priest. And what happened was he used to come down every day to check on the prisoners in solitary. And he wouldn't come in the cell. He'd open the hatch and say, you okay? Do you need anything? And one day he came down and he opened the hatch and he saw me kicking my book around. So he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm playing football with this book. So he said, well, why don't you read it? It might be easier. I said, well, I can't read. So he said, what, you can't read at all? And I had a little bit of basics, if you know what I mean, because I had done a bit of schooling. But he decided to bring me in some easy readers, Janet and John and stuff like that. And every day when he come, I'd ask him about words. And gradually I was picking it up. And then he said, look, I'll try and get you a pad and a pencil. And he went to the schools and said, can he have a pad and a pencil? And apparently they went to the governor and the governor went, no, we're not giving him a pencil. We'll poke it in someone's eye. This is what they thought of me at the time. So I ended up with crayons. They gave me crayons because they were quite soft. And I kind of learned to read and write then. But once I could read a bit, it kind of made prison easier for me because then I could, I had something to occupy my time. There was no televisions in those days in prison. If you had a radio, it could only be a transistor radio that big and it had to have an earphone. And I had no one outside to send me a transistor radio, so reading was basically my thing. Before that, it was a nightmare. I'd be hours and hours, days and days in cells and doing nothing, counting the bricks. I mean, people really do that, count the bricks. You were allowed a shower every 2 weeks as well and a change of kit. I remember that. And so I kind of, by the time I got out of Borstal then, I could read and I could write a bit, but I kind of thought to myself, what am I going to do in my life? And I went looking for jobs. And back in those days, jobs, I mean, the average job for me would have been a sort of builder's labourer, about £16 a week. And I couldn't be, after what I'd been through, I could not settle down. I was restless all the time. And eventually got together with a couple of pals of mine, and we decided to hit the big time. And we went out robbing, and we done quite well for a while. We became professionals. We met other robbery teams, and we started doing the big jobs. Never massive. We never got enough money to retire on. I don't think you ever do, unless you're a fraudster or computer expert. But I met a girl, had 3 children, and carried on with my life up until the 80s. What I used to do in the 80s, I started working properly in the 80s. I was into demolition. But they were kind of occasional jobs, if you know, casual jobs. So I might work somewhere for 2 weeks and then I'll be laid off for 3 weeks. So what I used to do was, on my own, I used to go out and do an armed robbery on my own. Normally with my fingers in a paper bag or with a fake gun, a toy gun. And I only done one every now and again, just to keep the money flowing into the house when I was out of work, and never really took it on as a professional profession again until around about 1986. And what happened was, I had a really good job. I was a hod carrier for a couple of bricklayers, earning great money. Done it for 9 months. My wife was really happy, my missus, because I was coming home every day and things were good and doing great with the kids. And we were just starting to have a good life. And then I foolishly ended up at a pub in Brixton one night at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was packed. Somebody had to go at my sister. My brother come over and told me, and because I'd had a few drinks on me, I went over and sorted the geezer out, punched him, knocked him out, came out of the pub about 2 hours later, went down to the kebab shop, and there he was with all his pals. So I happened to have a cutthroat razor, which I always carried on me. That was why my nickname was Razor. And they steamed into me, 3 of them. I've managed, they're kicking my head in. I've managed to get this razor out and ended up slashing all 3 of them. One down the face, one across the head, and one down the back as he was running away. And on the Monday morning, I was just getting up for work at 5 o'clock in the morning, and there's banging on the front door, and I knew it was the police. And I was arrested for attempted murder, grievous bodily harm with intent, affray. And when they searched the house, down the side of my chair, they found a .22 Remington semi-automatic rifle. No ammunition, but I liked the gun. Always had one around the house, and they done me for possession of a firearm with intent, rather. So I ended up going to court for that. I got not guilty on the 3 slashings. It turns out that the guys I'd slashed were also very bad records for violence and didn't really want to give evidence in court, if you know what I mean. Even they wanted to deal with me outside court as I wanted to deal with them outside court. They were proper villains. So I ended up getting not guilty for that, but 2 years for the gun. And I'd been on remand in the scrubs for 11 months from the day I was arrested. So I'd lost my job. We'd lost everything, really. And with that, I just thought, when I get out, I'm going back into armed robbery big time, which I did. I ended up working with a gang who the police and the press nicknamed the Laughing Bank Robbers. The reason they called us the Laughing Bank Robbers is we liked to have a laugh when we were doing it. An example being, we robbed the Midland Bank in Clapham High Street on Christmas Eve on my birthday. If you can't get no luck on your birthday, when can you? It never worked out for me in 1977, but we robbed this bank at Christmas Eve, and there was a guy outside selling Santa hats for £1. And just for a laugh, I went, kids free at them, mate. And we put the ski masks on and put the Santa hats on over the ski masks, on top of the ski masks, and went in, ho, ho, ho in, robbed the bank. And then our next bit of fun was robbing the bank next to Hendon Police College, just as a kind of 2 fingers to the police. And they actually came out, the recruits, and chased us, never caught us. And we committed robberies. We were doing what was called back in the 90s the reserve game, which was not just robbing banks. We were stealing the reserve that the bank had for the week or the month. And what used to happen was, we noticed it was certain banks, the Midland Bank and the Yellow Irish, we had people in there. And they used to deliver their money. Security Corps would deliver their bulk money, anything under 50,000, say on a Thursday morning. and it would go into the head cashier's safe under you can't do this no more, then banks don't exist, so I'm not revealing any secrets. It would go into the head cashier's safe rather than the vault, because the vault was on a time lock. So if you came in straight after the guards had delivered and told them to open the safe, you would be getting away with a nice chunk of money. We were taking between 36 and 50,000 pound every time we done a robbery. There was 4 of us, but you know, it was good money. And eventually what happened was I started to have misgivings about it in 1997. We were going to rob a bank in London Road, and we were coming across the pavement, and I got to the door, I pulled my mask on, I was pulling the gun out, and I got to the door and I just suddenly stopped, and I thought, what am I doing? This is just madness. Just that moment of stopping, and the other 2 bumped into me from behind because I was supposed to go straight through the door. But I quickly put it out my head, went and robbed the bank. And then afterwards I was thinking, you know what, I've really got to give this a miss. But eventually, as always happens, I went into work again. I became a painter and decorator with my cousin. I was working with him. But the flying squad were watching me for like months. They had me under surveillance. They knew it was me. They just couldn't prove anything. And eventually I was arrested, and they charged me with 8 armed robberies and possession of firearms. And I was given 8 life sentences under the 2 strike act, and 8 lots of 10 years concurrent. So 80 years concurrent for the firearms. I'd done a couple of prison escapes in the past as well. So, you know, I was all of a sudden I was a category A top security prisoner in Belmarsh. And, you know, I must admit, getting 8 life sentences, I said to my barrister, my QC, who I've had since I was a youngster, and he was a young barrister when I first met him. He's a judge now. But I remember coming down the steps, coming down the Old Bailey into the off bail cell and speaking to my brief just after I'd been sentenced. And I said, how long do you reckon I'll do at this? Because it was a brand new sentence, 2 strike life. And he said, well, the judge has given you a minimum of 11 years. He said, but with your record, he said, you've got to be looking at serving up to about 25, maybe 26 years on this. That's my opinion. He said, the good news is, he said, when it comes to a parole hearing, I'll represent you, obviously. But he said, but that could be 15, 16 years down the line. And I just thought, my life's over. That's it. My life's over. I'm never going to see the streets again. I accepted that. It took me a while, a couple of months. I was in Belmarsh. Then I moved to Whitemoor. They put me in Whitemoor prison in Cambridgeshire. And what happened was, my son Joseph, who was my younger son, he was 19 at the time. He'd been getting into a bit of trouble outside. He'd been sort of following in my footsteps. And I had him up at Belmarsh prison. His probation officer brought him up, and we had a private meeting. And I spoke to him, and I said, look, you're just wasting your life. Look at me. You know what I mean? I may never see the streets again. Had a good chat with him, and off he went. And then he got not guilty on his court case for robbery. And about 3 weeks after that, I spoke to him on the phone. And then I was coming back from tea in Whitemoor with a mate of mine, Bud, a big drug dealer from up north, Geordie. And when you see a priest or a rabbi or an imam or a vicar on the landings in prison in a top security dispersal, you know it's bad news for someone. And I came back, and as we come through, I've seen the priest up the end, and I've elbowed Bud, and I went, bad news for someone, Bud? He went, yeah. And when I got up, he was outside my cell. So this priest said to me, Noel Smith, he said, I'm afraid your son's died. So I didn't want to accept it. So I went, fuck off. And I've closed the door in his face. I said, go away, you've got the wrong person. Didn't want to accept it. And anyway, after a little while I did, and they let me get on the phone and speak to my wife. And it was true. So I was devastated, obviously. And then the next thing was, everyone was saying, they got to let you go to your son's funeral.
What did he die? No, what did he die of?
It was a verdict. I think it was, they didn't have a verdict on it. You know, one of them ones where they don't have a verdict. He died in mysterious circumstances, let's put it that way. And all the CCTV went missing. The police hated him. He'd been having a lot of trouble with the police. Him and his mates, they were taggers and doing silly robberies and stuff like that. So the police absolutely detested him. And that night he died. All of the CCTV around there disappeared for some reason. We've never been able to see it. Anyway, it turned out the security governor there at Whitemoor at the time had been a young prison officer, and I had broken his mate's jaw because I was forever fighting the screws when I was young. I'm really proper. I had some bad beatings, and I gave out some bad beatings. And it turned out he had a long memory, this guy. And I went to ask to be allowed out for the funeral, and he made me beg. He said, "You've got to beg to get out there." He said, "Because you've got a bad record." And I begged, and in the end he went, "My decision is no." He said, "It doesn't matter if I sent you out there with 6 of my staff." He said, "If anything goes wrong, they would end up hurt and you would end up gone and not serving your life sentences." So that was a devastating blow. And I went back to my cell. I remember going back to my cell, and guys, now you're talking about in Whitemoor, there was nobody in for shoplifting. They're all double figure sentences. These are all notorious, vicious people. Coming to my cell door and saying, "It's a fucking liberty what they've done to you, not letting you go to your son's funeral." And to make it even worse, around the same time, Jeffrey Archer was in prison. His mum's funeral, they let him out. He was out for the reception and everything, for the wake. No handcuffs, nothing, just one screw in plain clothes. They wouldn't let me go to my son's funeral. And these guys said, "Look, what we're going to do," everyone on the wing got together and said, "What we're going to do is we're going to make a stand here. And they told me the plan. The plan was to get the washing up liquid, buckets of washing up liquids, pour it all over the floors. There were metal floors in there. And then press the alarm, get tooled up, press the alarm bell. When the screws come running on and slip, that they were going to do the whole lot of them as a gesture to me." And I thought, yeah. And that night I thought, no. I thought, is that a tribute to my son? You know what I mean? And yeah, so the next day I said to him, "No, don't." I said, "Don't bother." And instead, what I did was, after I'd grieved for a certain amount of time, I still haven't grieved yet, but after a certain amount of time, I decided to look around the prison system for the first time, even though I thought I was never getting out, to look for some sort of rehabilitation, because it was not offered as standard. People talk about it a lot, but you don't get offered it, really. The small islands of it, you know, there is some rehabilitation, not now, but there was some, but it was so far away, if you know what I mean. It wasn't offered as standard to prisoners, especially prisoners like me. So I decided to look around, and I heard about this prison called Grendon in Buckinghamshire. My brother-in-law had been there. You had to volunteer to go there. And it was a therapeutic prison that worked on all your issues and had a really great success rate. And it only took serious recidivists, people who were serious violent or sexual criminals, who had been in many times and nothing had worked. And I decided to volunteer for it, and I volunteered for it. And you had to take an IQ test in order to see if you would be able to understand the therapy. And I failed the IQ test. And I'd thought I was quite clever. I'd been reading books all my life and, you know, thought I was quite intelligent. And when I failed the IQ test, I thought, wow. And they decided, lucky enough, to let me take another one. And this one was a different one. The first one was, it was all different shapes, a book of shapes. And you had to go through it, and it got harder and harder, and you had to say which shape belonged where. But the second one they done was word association and more of an intelligence test. And I passed that with flying colours, thank God. And ended up being shipped out to Grendon. Now, Grendon's got a reputation in the prison system as a kind of a bad nick for wrong-uns, people who want to hide out. There's a lot of rapists, there's a lot of child sex offenders there. The difference is you don't mix with them. They're on their wing. They do a different type of therapy. But there were certain people on all the wings who, in the prison system, you would attack on sight. You know, granny bashers, rapists, people who've hit kids or whatever, you know, those kind of guys. And in order to get into Grendon, you had to not attack them, and you had to mix with them. And a lot of people in the system said, no, not for me, not doing it. But people were glad to see me go there in Whitemoor. I got a good send-off because people realised I needed to change my life. You know, I was doing 8 life sentences. My son died. I can't even go to his funeral. And I had to do something. I was determined to do something about it. I was determined to change my life completely. And at that time, bearing in mind, I thought I'd never get out. You know, it wasn't for getting out. It was to do it. So I went in with the right attitude, and sure enough, Grendon was a completely different prison. And you know, I was there for 5 years in therapy, and I've done psychodrama, and it was hard to get into, and it was hard to understand at first, and it was, you know, it was very emotional for me. But eventually I dealt with a lot of my problems in there, and I became a chairman on the wing, and ended up spending 5 years. They reckon 18 months is like a good time to spend in Grennan. You can get your, for me, it was 5 years, you know, it was way over. And, but I emerged from Grendon as a much better human being. I'd managed to drop off all the armor, the weapons that I'd spent years gathering around me, you know, and I kind of, for the first time, prison officers were calling me by my first name, and I was calling them by their first name. You know, back in the days in Parkhurst and Albany and Whitemore, if you were seen talking to a prison officer more than twice, you get stabbed. We hated them, and they had done some bad things to me over the years. But both sides let all that drop, and it became a place of peace, really, and a piece of change. And I managed to change my life. And for the first time, I started looking at my victims, and there were so many. And yeah, as I say, it was a very emotional time. And I went through that, and I've done my 5 years. And eventually, I'd been up for parole 4 times and been refused. And the Home Office, the Home Secretary would refuse me every time. The parole board would say yes, the Home Secretary said no, because of my previous record. And eventually, after 4 years, I was given parole, but not to be released. I was given time in an semi-open prison. So I went to Blantyre House in Kent. And I was there for 2 years. And while I was there, I managed to get home leaves and family visits. And I managed to get a job outside. And all this time I'd been writing. My first book had come out in, I think it was 2003, and became a worldwide bestseller, A Few Kind Words and a Loaded Gun. And then I wrote another 7 books whilst I was in prison. And eventually, after 12 years, bear in mind my original tariff was 11 years, but it had been cut to 8 years as my minimum at the appeal court. So I served 11 years, no, 12 years. I served 12 years. And I was given parole in 2010. Now, the funny thing is, in 1990, I was inside during the Strangeways riots. We had a bit of a riot in Wandsworth. There were 33 other riots around the prison system when Strangeways was going on. I don't know if you know that. People died in Strangeways, and that changed the system. One of the recommendations to come out of it was by Lord Wolf, who done the investigation, was that prisoners should have an outside platform in order to get their questions answered and to have their stories told, and to, you know, to learn the rules of prison if they needed to. Someone they could go to that wasn't within the system and go, is this right? So a guy called Eric McGraw and Rachel Billington, Lord Longford's daughter, set up Inside Time, which was a prisoner's newspaper. And for the first time, we had a national prison newspaper. And it was only 4 pages, and it came every 2 months. But it was great. You could write into them, and they would publish a letter. So people like me, who fancied themselves maybe as a bit of a writer, I'd never really, you know, I'd never really done anything with it, but I'd read so many books that I thought, maybe I can do this. And I wrote a letter into them, and they published it. I was just amazed. And ever since then in jail, I'd always wrote for them. I'd written articles, you know, letters about what was going on in the prisons I was in. So I was doing quite well with them. And when I got out, I went. And
is that what started you writing your books then? The writing?
No, I wrote my first book after my son Joseph died, and I wanted to put my life in some sort of order so the other kids could see exactly what had happened to me and how I'd ended up where I was. And that was, I had a friend called Will Self. He's a writer, and you know, he's written a lot of books himself. And John McVicker, who used to be Public Enemy #1. John McVicker was friends with Will Self, and through John, I met Will. And Will used to come to visit me in prison, and the first thing he said to me was, I am not publishing anything for you or acting in any way for you if you're still a criminal. He said, if you ever want to give crime up, come and see me, he said, because I think you've got some talent as a writer. So now I've given crime up. Me and Will are getting on really great. And after my son died, and the funeral was quite expensive, and I'd stolen all this money in my life, and I didn't have a penny. And it really hurt me that my in-laws had to pay for the funeral. We hadn't really got on, me and the in-laws. They're great people, they really are. But we'd had a bit of a love-hate relationship, and for them to pay for his funeral burnt me. So when Will come up, he'd been asking me to write my life story for ages, and I said, look, how much could I get for it? Could I get enough to contribute to the funeral? He said, how much you need? I said, about £2,000. He said, I'll give you £2,000. I went, no. So it's got to come from me. So he said, all right. He said, write 3 chapters and a synopsis. He said, and I'll punt it about. 3 weeks later, he got in touch with me again and said, look, he said, there's a bidding war for it. Penguin won it. He said, I would go with Penguin because that was his firm at the time he was working from. He said, I'd go with them. They've never done a criminal autobiography, and they're quite interested in this. But it was 780,000 words originally, the size of a Bible or something. You know, I just sat there 6 hours a day in my cell writing. And they eventually cut it down to 300,000. And Penguin released the book, and the book sold worldwide. You know, I got so much interest. It was unreal. And that opened up for me another kind of branch. I'm thinking to myself, I don't have to be a criminal. There's something else out. I'm actually, people who are writing to me are not criminals. For the first time, I'm getting letters, not from people in other prisons, but from straight people who get on in the world, who've been to university, who've been to college, you know, and they're writing to me because they like my writing. And that gave me a right boost. And I just became a writer. I wrote another 7 books. Anyway, I got out, and I kind of got entangled with this woman from Southampton while I was in jail. She wrote to me after the book came out, and I've got to say, the picture on the front cover of A Few Kind Words is of me when I was 21, and I'm holding my son, who's a toddler at the time, in one arm and a gun in the other hand. And I was quite good looking. I had like plenty of hair, white teeth. I was slim. And it was quite a nice picture. And I ended up getting letters from women all around the world when because they'd seen the cover of the book.
What did the other prisoners make of it?
Oh, they used to laugh their heads off. They, oh, pass one on to me, pen friend, and all that. One day, it was so bad, I swear. I was in Grenham one day. I got called down to reception, and they said, you've got a parcel here. And when I opened the box, because they open it in front of you, there was 20 pairs of women's knickers, all different colours. And the woman had wrote a letter and said, could you sign all 20 pairs? And I'll wear them.
Wow.
And I thought,
wow.
Jesus. You know, it was just strange. But then I had some
Did they read your books, the other prisoners?
Yes,
did they read them? Yeah.
I wrote a piece about it some years after for GQ magazine. And I think looking into it, after I've done all the therapy and all that, I think I was their ideal man. I was locked up in jail, so I weren't going to turn up on their doorstep drunk, you know, and they could fantasize about me, and they could like kind of that sort. But if they met the real me, it was nothing like the picture on the front of the book, you know. But what happened was, well, a few of the women who were writing to me, I kept about 3 or 4 of them as pen friends. And I got on really well with a woman from Southampton. So when I got out, I moved down to Southampton to be with her. And it turns out Inside Time offices are in Southampton. So I decided to go over there my first week out just to say hello and to see the office. And they hired me. The guy was leaving that day, an ex-prisoner who'd been working for him since the start. And they offered me his job. And I thought, I don't know if I can do this, work in an office. It's just crazy. But there I was, working in an office and, you know, living down here. I live in Fareham now, which is not far from Southampton. I'm in great touch with all my family, you know, my kids and that. And it's just...
But no, was it really difficult having... Because there's a camaraderie in prison, isn't there? And it's a different world, really. So... was it really difficult to adjust when you came out?
Massively. You wouldn't believe. I mean, I tell people this, it's quite hard to understand, but the thing is, from a very young age, I've been in prison, in and out of prison. I didn't do the things that most teenagers do. I didn't get my first job. I didn't, you know, end up married and get a mortgage and, you know, get a driving license, a passport. I never had none of those things. I was a criminal. If I wanted a passport, I'd buy one. If I wanted a driving license, I'd buy one. You know, everything's for sale in the criminal world. So I'd never done any of that stuff. For me, it was starting again. For the first time ever, I've had to pay tax. I've paid rent. And each step was just so difficult, registering with a doctor. When you're in jail, they say, do you want to see the doctor? There he is over there. So like you go from wing to wing. Now, I was talking to my doctor about a year ago, and what happened was my medication had run out. I'm a diabetic, and I had a stroke 2 years ago. My medication ran out, and I just went, so what? I never went to the doctor. And then I got really bad. And when I went to him, it turned out he was an ex-Navy man. And he said, look, he said, I have the same. He said, a lot of my patients are ex-services. He said, and they are exactly the same as you. When they're in the services, everything is there on hand. Everything is done. You don't have to do anything except be you. He said, and when you get out, when you come out of services or out of prison, there is nothing. There's no aftercare. You have to start again, and you have to learn to do things. He said, so I completely understand. So there's that kind of thing. I've been driving all my life. I worked it out that I'd owned 290 cars in my life, 290 cars and probably about 40 motorbikes. I'd never had a driving license. I'd never had insurance. You know, if it had tax on it when I got it, fair enough. If it didn't, I didn't care. Once it ran out of petrol, I'd dump it and buy another one or steal one. And this was the hardest thing for me, was getting a driving license. I've taken my driving test 5 times and failed all 5 times, and I've now given up. I think myself, it's not worth it. It cost me a fortune, and can't drive because I've got some bad habits. And when I was in Blantyre House Prison, which was semi-open, they let you take in there to prepare for the outside. They open you a bank account, and I opened my bank account with a bank that I used to rob all the time. And I went down the first day to see about my card. And the guy behind the counter recognised me, the manager. He said, I know you. I said, how do you know me? He said, you robbed my bank when I was up in North London about 20 years ago. I said, hold up a minute. I said, when I was robbing banks, I had a mask on. He said, I was at your trial. I see your face. So I didn't realise he'd given evidence against me. But what he said, I hope you're not robbing. I said, no. I said, I want a bank account now. But things like that. They also gave me what they call they said, can you drive? Because you might need a licence outside. So I said, yeah. So let me have an assessment test with a local driving instructor. He drove up to the prison. It's out in the country, this prison, country lanes. So he said, have you driven before? I said, yes. So he said, all right. He said, get into the driver's seat. He said, drive me down to the station. Now, it's all winding country lanes. After about 5 minutes, he went, pull over wherever it's safe. So I pulled over. So he went, Mr. Smith, he said, you drive like a getaway driver. I went, thanks very much. He said, that's not a compliment. He said, why have you got one arm out the window and one arm on the steering wheel? I said, it's summer. He said, why are you honking the horn every time you come to a bend in the road? I said, let people know I'm coming. He said, no, slow down. So I was glad I didn't wheel spin out the car park as I was going to do. But stuff like that, you know, and things that everyone done when they were young, I've had to do in my 50s. And it has been hard, but I'll tell you what, it's been so good to be out of jail. And because I work for the paper, every day I'm reading letters from prison. That's my job, you know, to go through the letters. And I think a lot of things haven't changed. And that was me 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you know. And what I try and do every month is this. We've got this thing where we try and give the good news to prisoners. And I like to interview ex-prisoners, ex-prison officers, people who have come out and made it in life, to show people inside that you don't have to just sit on your ass in there and you ain't got no future. People have actually come out of jail and done something. That's my favourite thing, is interviewing ex-prisoners and seeing how far they've come. And
when you're in that place of, you know, being solitary, and I think if you haven't got anybody on the outside, and you can feel like there's no hope. Not that I've ever been in there, but I mean, I've spoken to a few people who have in my time, and
well, I've done what a lot of long-term prisoners do when they get life sentences. I cut off the outside. You don't want visits. You know, I used to make a phone call to my wife once a week, but you don't want it because you can't live 2 lives in prison. I'll give you an example. When
it becomes your new world, doesn't it?
It
that
does.
Is your world.
It has to. It has to. Otherwise, you will go completely mad.
And they become your family. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, look up the statistics of how many long-term prisoners end up in mental institutions just from doing their sentences. You cannot, waking up every day and knowing that you may never be going home and you're facing the same people and the same things every day is an absolute nightmare. You know, some people have had a taste of near solitary during this pandemic. It hasn't bothered me. You know, my wife is pulling her hair out, and other people around me are going mental. And I just treat it like a prison sentence. I've been in solitary confinement for months and months on end with nothing. I can open my door now and look outside if I want. I could never do that for years. I can eat what I want when I want. You know, it's just a different world. But I was in Belmarsh when I first got sentenced, and me and another fella, and there was a fella sitting in between us, and he was a first timer. And he looked at his watch and he went, wow, 10 to 12. He said, I'd just be having lunch with my missus now. And I just looked at him and I went, mate, get that out of your head. You ain't going to be having lunch with your missus for the next 20 years. I said, you either live in here or you live outside, and you can't live in both, which you can't. It drives you absolutely mad. I've seen people coming off visits with their families and being absolutely devastated for days. You know, and putting on a brave face on a visit, come back crying. You know, human beings are not naturally meant to be in captivity. It's it's an unnatural state for us.
I think I question what it's actually doing. I don't know if you saw, I interviewed Chris Daw a while ago, you know, the barrister. And he's doing a lot of work around, he'd like to see prison abolished. He doesn't see the point either. And having spoken to him and done some of the work that I've done, and I think I agree. I can't see, you know, there's that one in, where is it? I can't remember the name of the place, but there's that prison that is an open prison where the prisoners go home to see their families. It's in another country.
Oh, it's Norway and Sweden.
Norway, that's it, yeah. That system. But for people, I mean, because a lot of the people who are in prison are mentally ill.
Yes.
A lot of them
are made mentally ill by prison.
Yes, yeah.
You know, so many people every year go out of prison and into mental institutions. It is unreal. It really is. I went mad a couple of times in there, and it was only by luck and by maybe willpower that I did not end up the way Charlie Bronson and people like that, and loads more people who you've never even heard of are in those situations. The thing about prison is this: what embarrasses and should embarrass this government around the world is that you can go into prison, serve unable to read and write, serve a 20-year sentence, and come out still unable to read and write. I was lucky. I had someone who took an interest. I read my records. I got my prison records about 6 years ago under the Freedom of Information Act. No, Data Protection Act. And when I was reading through, there was one quote in 1977 from a probation officer when I was doing my 3 years detained. And I'll never forget it. This is at the age of 16. And she said in her report, I'll never forget this, Smith is one of a small group of boys who are destined to spend their lives in and out of institutions. Do nothing for him. That was actually marked on there. Do nothing for him. So when I applied to go on a draftsman's course in Balsa, they called me educationally subnormal. So no, you won't be able to do nothing. You can't even read. So, you know, prison doesn't give you anything. It doesn't. All it does is contain you. And some people are happy with that. Some people are happy that the baddies are contained. But what you've got to take into account, in my experience, and 3 decades of prison, and I've been to loads of different prisons, I would say there's probably about 5,000 or 6,000 people in this country who need to be kept in prison because they are a danger to the public. They're a serious danger. 5,000 or 6,000. The rest are all, the other 85,000 are window dressing. You know, they're there because, you know, nobody can think what else to do with them. People who are addicted to alcohol or drugs, who have to steal to feed their habits. People who are homeless. People who are mentally ill. Where do they go? They go to prison.
And the white collar crime. I mean, these people could be doing other things. They could be doing other stuff and working and doing community work and all sorts of things like that would help society.
It used to annoy the crap out of us that you'd be in a prison and you'd be bear in mind that some of the people in prison have got pretty good skills. You've got people who are bricklayers on the out. People who are plasterers, people who are scaffolders. Yet when they want a prison's in dilapidated state, they never let the prisoners fix it. They call in expensive outside contractors. I said to them one day, they were building a wall within the prison. I said, you've got 9 qualified bricklayers on this wing and you're paying them geezers out there 90 quid a day to build a wall. Why don't you let us do it? It's good practice. You know, you don't get paid a decent wage.
I think
education.
And what concerned me was the degree of anxiety that was inflicted on people. It seems like that's common to get people onto meds because they want to be taking Prozac and things like that because they are getting depressed in there, and then to refuse to give it to them or not allow them down to get their meds. Just the unnecessary chaos and taunting little things that would build up. That concerns me, the degree of anxiety. And I think that you could go in there for something fairly small and come out really quite damaged. So how on earth you've survived and got to where you've got it's phenomenal, really. The strength, the resilience that you must have.
The absolute ignorance of what was going on. But there are people in prison. Prison is a macho environment, men's prisons. A really macho environment. You can't show any weakness. So a lot of people who are not really criminals, they kind of get caught in that undertow, and their lives are ruined in prison. They have no sort of sense of life in jail because they're the weaker, lower people. And that's the prison system is built like that. The strongest survive and the weak people go under. And, the amount of bullying I've seen in prisons from prison staff as well, let's bear in mind, they tried to hang me in Wandsworth, the prison staff, because I tried to get out on an escape with a JCB and assaulted several officers, not me, loads of people, but 7 of us. But, I've actually had them come into my cell with a knotted sheet, 3 officers after bang up, and tell me the next time you assault a prison officer in here, you're going to be hanging off them bars, and nobody won't give a shit because you'll just be a statistic. Nobody gives a shit about people in prison. And he was right. Nobody cares about people in prison. There are people out here now that are sort of taking an interest, which is good, because some people have seen what bang up is like now. Before they went, lock them up, it ain't that bad. Give them a bit of hay every 2 weeks or something, they'll be all right. But people are now realising that it is a punishment. Having your liberty taken away from you is the actual punishment. That's the only punishment of prison is supposed to be. All the rest is extraneous when you get in there.
Yeah. So tell me, and I'm aware of your time. You said you wanted to talk about your new book as well. So tell me a bit about that before you leave me.
I'll do a quick plug on that. What it was, I was in. It's really strange. There was when I was working with the Laughing Bank Robbers in the 90s, we used to go over to North London and Northwest London to commit our robberies because we were from South London. And at the same time, there was another gang who we didn't know in Northwest London who used to come to our area and commit their robberies there. Now, we meet up in jail. The other gang were known as the Dirty Dozen. And it was the Bradish brothers, and they're all Northwest London mob. And they became the most infamous armed robbers in this country at one stage. The newspapers were full of them when they were getting sentenced because they looked like Grant and Phil Mitchell. So they called them the Mitchell brothers. And they'd committed something like 140 armed robberies over a period of 5 years and never been nicked on any single robbery. And the flying squad had them under surveillance for 4 years. And they're coming over robbing us. Anyway, we all get together in that. Sean Bradish got a life sentence. Vinny Bradish got 22 years. I got 8 life sentences. My mate got a life sentence. So we all meet up in Whitemore Prison. And as we're talking, all of a sudden it comes out. I knew Vinny from years ago when we were Teddy Boys, but suddenly he went, "Yeah, we robbed the bingo hall over at Malden." And I went, "Whoa, hold up a minute. We robbed the bingo hall over in North London." So it turned out we've been crossing targets all the time, and the police were trying to get them. Anyway, they ended up quite a big case, their case. And whilst I was in jail, we got talking about it, and Vinny said to me, "Look, if ever a book comes out of this," he said, "I'd like you to write it." And sure enough, about 3 years ago, he gave me all the depositions, and he went, "There you go, you should write the book." So I got in touch with John Blake Publishers, said, "You interested in this book?" And they said, "Yeah, as long as it's not about the craze, we're interested in it," because every single crime book is about the craze nowadays. So they said yes, and I wrote the book, and it's like the inside story of. I had access to all the depositions and the legal papers, which most authors don't get because they belong to Vinny. And it's basically their story, how they had their rise to fame and their downfall, really. And it's not a glorification of crime. I try never to glorify crime. It's not glory crime. It's not. You have a few little good times, and for that you pay for the rest of your life. And I wouldn't recommend anybody to get into crime. It really is a disgrace, our prison system. Don't go there. But yeah, so I wrote the book, and they published it to much acclaim last August. Hopefully it's doing well. I've got to the stage now where it's my 9th book, and I don't even bother looking. I just think, well, you know, it's out there. If it goes well, it goes well.
And what's the title?
It's called The Dirty Dozen: Rise and Fall of London's Most Prolific Armed Robbers.
And published by?
John Blake.
John Blake.
It's a paperback, so it's quite cheap, $7.99.
And do you? Thank you. And do you have a website or a?
I don't.
No. So
I'm not very technically minded, and I tell you what, I've Facebook for me is about the height of it. People keep asking me to go on Twitter, and I won't go on Twitter because I get abused enough by my wife at home. I don't need it on Twitter. Because some people are strange, seriously. I've done a couple of like I do talks and stuff, and I've done some television programs and things like that. And when I first done them, I would see them on YouTube, and I'd start reading the comments underneath, and I just became incensed. People who didn't know me, probably sitting in their mum's bedroom, are calling me a murderer, and you know, just really outrageous things. So I don't read them no more. I just go, you know, whatever.
Do you think, like me? I mean, I also ran away and was homeless when I was 13 for a very short time, but it was still an experience. And I think, I don't know, I think we change throughout our lives, and we are different people. And everybody, because of course that's my counselling background coming through, I think everybody, given the right circumstances, can change if they want to. And there is hope for everybody.
I believe there's redemption for everybody. It depends on how much they need it and how much they want it. And
yeah,
it has
you've got
to
want to do
yourself.
it. Yeah,
it has to be you who does it. It can't be anybody else. People can help. Prisons like Grendon can help you if you're willing. And that was always the thing there. You had to be willing to change. If you weren't interested in changing, just go back to your other prison. You know, and I think it really has to start with you, and it has to be something. With me, it was the death of my son. That was the catalyst for me wanting to change. It made me think for the first time in my life, you know, what was I doing? But I think once you do start to change, you know, as long as you're determined to do it, you can do it. You know, I've done
and isn't it funny how then you end up, when you do it, helping other people?
Yeah,
because that's what you're doing, isn't it? You do a lot with your.
I do a lot of talks in schools. I'm doing a couple a week actually on Zoom. But I like to. I work a lot with David Wilson, Professor David Wilson. He used to be the governor of Grendon. Actually, I first met him when he was a prison governor. Strange, isn't it? We're both doing stuff like that now. But yeah, and his criminology students, first year criminology students and psychology students, I do a lot of talks to those kind of students, and because I think it's important, they learn a lot from textbooks and stuff about the law and, you know, everything else. But I think it's important for them to hear from someone who's actually been on the other side, because I hate to think of somebody becoming a prison psychologist without ever having talked to a prisoner. Or, you know, I've become a criminologist but never spoke to prisoners and never found out what the other side is. So I quite like doing that, and I get on really great with the kids, and, you know, they seem to like it. So I do a lot of visits at local schools as well, and now and again going to young offender institutions. I've actually been back to Rochester. That was an eye-opener, where I spent my most of my 3 years in 1977, 78, 79, and actually had a look at the block where I was kept in that cell, and it was frightening. Everything came back to me immediately, and I felt this foreboding hanging over me as I was going through the door. But speaking to the kids in there now, say kids, they're all like under 21, but, you know, speaking to them was great. And you always get the same thing when you speak to kids in YPs. You have, like, say, 50 of them in a classroom or in the library, and you say the one thing they always ask is, or they suggest is, you'll always get one putting his hand up and saying, look, I'm earning 600 quid a week selling dope on my estate, and you want me to give up crime. So what am I going to do then? And I just say to them, how long are you doing? 5 years. How much are you earning in here? 7 quid a week. Yeah, 7 quid a week, mate. So if you can live on 7 quid a week, you don't need to be earning 600 a week by putting yourself on offer all the time. But I try and show them that, you know, education, for me, education is the key. You cannot have rehabilitation without education. It's impossible. You know, I became rehabilitated partly because I became educated, and it was open for me to do so. But a lot of, I think it's 73% of prisoners in this country have a reading age below 12. You know, it really is. We're putting the most inadequate people in prison. We're treating them like big gangsters, putting them in these top security prisons.
Well, we're putting them in the prison university, aren't we, really, where they're learning more.
I'll give you an example of how bad it is. When I was leaving prison, I met this guy. He was doing 9 months. No, he had been on remand for 9 months, in prison for 9 months. And I said, what are you in for? And he said, attempted theft. So I said, what do you mean attempted theft? He said, I was on a train station and I see a suitcase. He said, and I thought, I'm having that. He said, so I picked up the suitcase, walked away, but I got nicked and there was nothing in the suitcase. It was an empty suitcase. And he said, I said, what are you expecting when you eventually appear in court? He said, 3 months. I said, how long have you done? He said, 9. This is how we're treating our prisons. This guy's in prison for 9 months. He's only going to get 3 months. And he's not violent. You know, it's his second offence, both petty offences. And our prisons are full of inadequate people, junkies who have to commit shoplifting to feed their rabbits, mental people, that sounds horrible, mentally unstable people who just shouting on your high street. They'll end up next door to a murderer in your local high security prison. How can that be right?
And aren't they costing something like 65,000 a year each to be in there?
You could send someone
phenomenal amount of money
for less than half the price.
Amount of money. Yeah.
If I was the Home Secretary, and I get asked this a lot, if I was in charge of the prisons, I would raise the prisons to the ground. I would absolutely, you know, we don't need 132 prisons in this country. We don't need them. We need maybe 6 prisons, and that's it. The rest is all window dressing. If you were to take the people who are addicted to alcohol and drugs and treat their addictions, and the people who are mentally unstable, treat them as patients rather than prisoners, our prisons would be empty. Seriously. I mean, it's just madness. It's beyond me. I wonder how, you know, we're paying out so much money every year, and what are we getting back for it? Nothing.
And they've all got to come out, most of them, at some time.
Yeah.
Onto the streets. Families have gone. What are they going to do? They're going to go back to it. Anyway, no, it's an absolute pleasure to have heard your story. I'm going to get your book.
Oh, nice.
And I'd love to keep in touch with you because I'm interested in what you're doing with Inside Time, that magazine of the newspaper. Sorry. Thank you so much. If people want to get in touch, or anyone wants to get in touch, may I put your email
of course,
at the end?
Okay. Yeah, no problem.
So, Noel Smith, thank you so much. And I will look forward to keeping in touch with you and hearing more maybe when your book is out.
Yeah, brilliant.
Or when you're doing another one.
Which I will be.
You will be, yeah. Thank you. And thanks for joining me.